Welcome. We're so happy you tuned in tonight. Before we get started, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's get comfortable and drift into deep, peaceful sleep together.
We'll start by treating a star's life the way we treat any long life, not as one dramatic moment, but as a slow sequence of steady phases that makes sense once you see the pattern. A star is, at its core, a balancing act, gravity pulling inward and energy pushing outward, held in a kind of calm tension that can last for an unimaginably long time. That balance is the sleepy heart of what we're exploring tonight. Even something enormous can spend most of its existence in quiet stability. First comes the before, when there is no star yet, only a spread-out mix of gas and dust in a region of a galaxy where material happens to be a little denser than elsewhere. Picture a cloud in space, not the white puffy kind you see from an airplane window, but something far more diffuse, stretching across distances that would take light years to cross. These clouds are called molecular clouds, and they're made mostly of hydrogen, the simplest and most abundant element in the universe, along with a smaller amount of helium and just traces of heavier elements. The cloud sits there in the dark between existing stars, cold and dim, with temperatures that might hover around 10 or 20 degrees above absolute zero. At those temperatures, molecules move sluggishly, and the cloud seems almost perfectly still from a human perspective. Though, of course, nothing in space is ever truly motionless. Over time, tiny differences in density matter. Gravity doesn't need urgency, it only needs patience. Even in a cloud this spread out, where atoms are separated by vast empty spaces, gravity is always present, always pulling. Every particle of matter attracts every other particle, even if the force is vanishingly small. In most of the cloud, this gentle inward pull is balanced by the slight outward pressure from the random motion of gas particles, and perhaps by magnetic fields threading through the cloud. But in regions where the cloud happens to be just a little denser, perhaps because of a passing shock wave from a nearby supernova, or the compression from a spiral arm of the galaxy, or simply random fluctuation, gravity has a bit more to work with. In these slightly denser regions, the pull becomes incrementally stronger because there's more mass in a given volume, and that stronger pull attracts more material from the surroundings, which makes the region denser still, which increases the gravitational pull further. It's a feedback loop, but one that unfolds over timescales that make human lifetimes look like quick flickers. The cloud slowly gathers itself, and as it gathers, it begins to change state, not suddenly, but inevitably, becoming more compact, more coherent, more like a single future object rather than a loose environment. As the material falls inward, it doesn't fall perfectly. The cloud has some rotation to begin with, inherited from the motion of the galaxy itself and from local turbulence in the interstellar medium. Angular momentum means it tends to flatten into a rotating structure as it contracts, much like a spinning ice skater pulls in their arms and spins faster, or like pizza dough spreads into a disk when you spin it. The collapsing cloud forms what astronomers call a protostellar disk, with material spiraling inward toward a growing central concentration. Collisions within the gas turn motion into heat. When gas particles fall toward the center, they speed up, converting gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy, the energy of motion. But these particles don't fall in isolation. They bump into other particles, and those collisions randomize the directed inward motion into random thermal motion, which we experience as heat. The temperature starts to climb, especially near the center, where the density is highest and collisions are most frequent. At this stage, the star is still a work in progress, a protostar, fed by continuing inflow from the surrounding disk and envelope, growing more massive, more pressurized, and warmer at its center. Nothing about this is quick. The main idea is accumulation, matter arriving, settling, and tightening the conditions needed for the next step. A protostar might take hundreds of thousands of years to form, maybe a few million years, depending on the details of the cloud and how much material is available. During this time, the protostar is hidden inside a thick cocoon of dust and gas, so we can't see it in visible light, but it glows brightly in infrared, because the heat from all that infalling material radiates outward at wavelengths our eyes can't detect, but our instruments can measure. The protostar continues to contract under its own gravity, and as it does, the core temperature rises. At first, the temperatures are only in the thousands of degrees, hot by everyday standards, but not nearly hot enough for what comes next. The protostar is supported partly by the thermal pressure of the hot gas, and partly by the pressure that comes from the fact that the gas hasn't yet settled into a stable configuration. It's still adjusting, still finding its shape. Jets of material sometimes shoot out from the poles of the rotating disk, carrying away excess angular momentum and allowing more material to spiral inward. These jets can stretch for light years, visible in certain wavelengths as beautiful streamlined structures threading through the surrounding cloud. Eventually, the central pressure and temperature climb high enough that the star's true engine can begin. The core temperature reaches about 10 million degrees Kelvin, a threshold where something remarkable becomes possible. At these temperatures, hydrogen nuclei, which are just single protons, the simplest atomic nucleus, are moving fast enough to overcome the electrical repulsion that normally keeps them apart. Protons are positively charged, and like charges repel, so under normal circumstances they push each other away. But at 10 million degrees, the thermal speeds are so high that when protons collide, they can get close enough for the strong nuclear force to take over. The strong nuclear force is one of the fundamental forces of nature, and it operates only at extremely short ranges. But when it does operate, it's powerful enough to bind protons together despite their electrical repulsion. The first sustained nuclear fusion in the core marks the transition from forming to being. Hydrogen nuclei start combining into helium through a series of reactions collectively known as the proton-proton chain, or, in more massive stars, the carbon-nitrogen-oxygen cycle. Either way, the end result is the same. 4 hydrogen nuclei fuse to create one helium nucleus, and in the process, a small amount of mass is converted directly into energy according to Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. That small amount of mass produces an enormous amount of energy, because the speed of light squared is such a large number. This energy emerges as high energy, photons, gamma rays, and as kinetic energy of the resulting particles. The gamma rays immediately start bouncing around inside the dense core, scattering off electrons and ions, gradually working their way outward through the star. This journey from core to surface can take tens of thousands of years, even though the photons are traveling at the speed of light, because they're constantly being absorbed and re-emitted, taking a random walk through the star's interior. and the star finally becomes what we recognize as a stable light source, not because it is finished changing, but because it has found a self-correcting rhythm. The energy generated by fusion in the core creates an outward pressure that pushes against the inward pull of gravity, and these two forces balance each other. This balance is called hydrostatic equilibrium, and it's the defining characteristic of a star that has reached the main sequence, the long, stable phase of its life. Now we settle into the longest portion of a typical star's life, the main sequence. This is the era of steadiness. For a star like our Sun, the main sequence lasts about 10 billion years. More massive stars burn through their fuel faster and have shorter main sequence lifetimes, perhaps only a few million years for the most massive stars. Less massive stars burn their fuel more slowly and can remain on the main sequence for tens of billions of years, longer than the current age of the universe. But regardless of mass, the main sequence is characterized by this fundamental stability, this balance between gravity and pressure. Fusion in the core produces energy. That energy creates outward pressure. Gravity counters it, and the star holds its shape in hydrostatic equilibrium. If the core tries to contract, it heats up and fusion speeds up, pushing outward a little more. If it expands too much, it cools and fusion slows, allowing gravity to pull it back in. The star doesn't decide to be stable, it simply behaves according to physics that naturally damp extremes. This kind of self-regulating system is called a negative feedback loop, and it's one of the reasons stars are so stable. Think of it like a thermostat in your home. When the temperature drops below the set point, the heater turns on. When it rises above the set point, the heater turns off. The system naturally keeps the temperature near the target. A star does something similar, but instead of a thermostat, it's the relationship between temperature, pressure, and fusion rate that provides the regulation. The star is constantly making tiny adjustments, responding to small fluctuations, keeping itself in balance without any conscious effort or external control. In this long middle, the star becomes a dependable feature of its neighborhood. It steadily converts hydrogen into helium, and over vast time, it changes gradually in ways that don't feel dramatic from moment to moment. If you could watch a main sequence star for 1,000,000 years, you'd notice very little change in its appearance. It would shine with the same brightness, the same color, the same steady output. But over hundreds of millions or billions of years, subtle shifts do occur. The core slowly becomes richer in helium ash. Every time 4 hydrogen nuclei fuse into one helium nucleus, that helium nucleus sinks toward the center of the core because it's heavier than hydrogen. The helium doesn't participate in the proton-proton fusion reactions. It's essentially inert at these temperatures. So gradually, the core develops a growing concentration of helium, while the hydrogen fuel becomes more concentrated in a shell around this helium-rich center. As the helium builds up, the conditions for fusion drift. The mean molecular weight of the core material increases. That is, the average mass per particle goes up because helium nuclei are about 4 times heavier than hydrogen nuclei. This increased weight means that for the same pressure, the core has to be denser and hotter to support itself against gravity. So over time, the core contracts slightly and heats up slightly, and the fusion rate increases slightly. For a sun-like star, brightness tends to creep upward over time, not as a sudden flare, but as a slow adjustment as the core composition changes and the balance point shifts. Our own sun has brightened by about 30% since it first settled onto the main sequence 4.5 billion years ago, and it will continue to brighten slowly as it ages. This brightening is so gradual that over human timescales it's completely imperceptible, but over geological timescales it has significant effects on planetary climates. There's a comforting lesson here. A star is not stable because nothing changes. It is stable because it changes in a controlled way. It is constantly responding to itself, constantly rebalancing. And that's a useful thought for sleep. Your body also rebalances quietly all night long without needing your attention, without needing you to fix anything. Your heart rate slows, your breathing deepens, your temperature drops slightly, your brain cycles through different stages of sleep. All of this happens automatically, governed by feedback loops and regulatory systems built into your biology. Just as a star's stability is built into its physics, the star continues its patient work. In the core, the fusion reactions proceed at a rate determined by the temperature and density. Each reaction converts a tiny amount of mass into energy, and that energy works its way outward through the star. In the deep interior, energy moves by radiation, photons bouncing from particle to particle. But in the outer layers, where the temperature is lower and the gas is less ionized, the opacity increases and radiation becomes inefficient. Here, energy is transported by convection instead. Convection is the same process that makes water boil in a pot or creates weather patterns in Earth's atmosphere. Hot material rises because it's less dense than its surroundings, and cool material sinks because it's more dense. In the outer layers of a sun-like star, this creates vast convective cells where hot gas rises toward the surface, cools by radiating energy into space, and then sinks back down to be reheated. These convection currents create the granulated appearance we see on the sun's surface, where each granule is the top of a convective cell, perhaps 1,000 kilometers across. The surface itself, the photosphere, is the visible layer from which light can escape directly into space. Below this layer, the gas is opaque enough that photons are constantly absorbed and re-emitted. Above it, the gas is so thin that photons can travel freely. The photosphere is only a few hundred kilometers thick, incredibly thin compared to the sun's radius of nearly 700,000 kilometers. But it's the layer we see when we look at the sun. The photosphere isn't perfectly smooth and uniform. It's marked by sunspots, darker regions where strong magnetic fields suppress convection and slightly cool the surface. It's crossed by faculae, brighter regions also associated with magnetic activity. The sun's magnetic field is generated by the motion of electrically conducting plasma in the convective zone through a process called the dynamo effect. As the sun rotates and convection stirs the plasma, electric currents are generated, and these currents create magnetic fields. The fields emerge through the surface, creating complex structures that evolve over time. The sun's rotation isn't uniform. It rotates faster at the equator than at the poles, a phenomenon called differential rotation. This differential rotation winds up the magnetic field lines, stretching and twisting them until they become tangled and stressed. Eventually, the field lines can snap and reconnect, releasing energy in the form of solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These are dramatic events by solar standards, but they're powered by magnetic energy stored in the sun's outer layers, not by changes in the fusion rate in the core. The core continues its steady work, unperturbed by the magnetic storms happening at the surface. Above the photosphere is the chromosphere, a thin layer where the temperature actually increases with height, contrary to what you might expect. Above that is the corona, the sun's outer atmosphere, where temperatures soar to millions of degrees, even though it's far from the heat source in the core. The mechanism that heats the corona is still not fully understood, but it likely involves magnetic energy being dissipated as waves and reconnection events. The corona is visible during a total solar eclipse as a pearly white halo around the dark disk of the moon, and it's the source of the solar wind, a stream of charged particles that flows outward through the solar system. But all of this activity at the surface and in the atmosphere is, in a sense, superficial. The star's true nature is determined by what happens in the core, and in the core, the fusion continues steadily, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. The hydrogen is consumed, the helium accumulates, and the star slowly evolves. Eventually, the star reaches a turning point when the hydrogen in its core becomes scarce for core fusion. This happens when roughly 10% of the core's hydrogen has been converted to helium, not because all the hydrogen is gone, but because the conditions for fusion become unfavorable as the helium concentration builds up. The star doesn't run out in a dramatic sense. It transitions. The core fusion of hydrogen gradually slows and then ceases, not because the temperature drops, but because there's not enough hydrogen left in the core to sustain the reactions. But fusion can continue in a shell around the core where hydrogen still exists. The core itself, now made almost entirely of helium, begins to contract under gravity because it's no longer supported by fusion energy. As it contracts, it heats up due to gravitational compression, the same process that heated the protostar long ago. This heat radiates outward into the hydrogen-burning shell, increasing the temperature there, and actually accelerating the fusion rate in the shell compared to what it was in the core during the main sequence. The shell fusion produces energy at a higher rate than the core fusion did, and this extra energy pushes the outer layers of the star outward. The star's structure becomes more layered. Different kinds of fusion and different physical conditions in different regions, like a life becoming more complex with age. The star is leaving its long, steady adulthood and moving into a later life phase. This is the beginning of the red giant stage. For a modest, sun-like star, this later phase often includes expansion into a red giant. The details can be explained gently. As the core contracts and shell fusion intensifies, the outer layers puff outward. They expand to many times the star's original radius. Our sun, when it becomes a red giant in about 5 billion years, will swell to perhaps 100 times its current radius, large enough to engulf the inner planets, including Earth. But despite this enormous increase in size, the outer layers actually cool because the same amount of energy is being spread over a much larger surface area. A cool surface radiates light that's redder than a hot surface, which is why these stars are called red giants. Their surface temperature might drop to around 3,000 or 4,000 degrees Kelvin, compared to the sun's current surface temperature of about 5,700 degrees Kelvin. The cooler temperature means the light is shifted toward the red end of the spectrum, giving the star a distinctly orange or reddish color. The transition to a red giant doesn't happen overnight. It takes tens or hundreds of millions of years, depending on the star's mass. During this time, the star brightens considerably because even though the surface is cooler, the vastly increased surface area means the total energy output, the luminosity, is much higher. A red giant can be hundreds or thousands of times more luminous than it was on the main sequence. The expanded outer envelope of a red giant is only loosely bound to the star. The gravitational pull at the surface is weak because the mass is the same, but the radius is much larger, and gravity decreases with the square of the distance. Meanwhile, radiation pressure, the outward pressure exerted by the star's light, becomes more effective at pushing material outward. The star begins to lose mass through a stellar wind, a gentle but persistent outflow of gas from the surface. This isn't a violent explosion. It's more like evaporation, material slowly drifting away into space. Inside the star, the helium core continues to contract and heat up. If the star's mass is in the right range, roughly half a solar mass or more, the core can eventually become hot and dense enough to fuse helium into heavier elements. The temperature needed for helium fusion is much higher than for hydrogen fusion, about 100 million degrees Kelvin, because helium nuclei have 2 protons each, and thus a stronger electrical repulsion to overcome. When the core reaches this temperature, helium fusion begins. The primary reaction is called the triple alpha process because it involves 3 helium nuclei, also called alpha particles. 2 helium nuclei fuse to form an unstable beryllium nucleus, and if a 3rd helium nucleus collides with it quickly enough before it decays, they fuse to form a stable carbon nucleus. This process also releases energy, though less energy per reaction than hydrogen fusion. Sometimes the carbon nucleus can capture another helium nucleus to form oxygen. So the products of helium fusion are carbon and oxygen, and these accumulate in the core just as helium accumulated during hydrogen fusion. This helium burning period is another chapter of temporary steadiness, shorter than the main sequence, but still governed by the same theme: balance found, held for a time, then slowly altered as fuel and conditions evolve. For a sun-like star, helium fusion lasts perhaps 100 million years, much shorter than the 10 billion year main sequence lifetime. More massive stars burn helium faster, less massive stars burn it more slowly, if they can ignite it at all. Stars less than about half a solar mass never get hot enough to fuse helium. Their helium cores just sit there, contracting and heating, but never reaching the ignition temperature, supported eventually by a quantum mechanical effect called electron degeneracy pressure rather than by thermal pressure. Each new fuel stage is like a new season, distinct but not chaotic. The star burns helium in its core while continuing to burn hydrogen in a shell around the core. The energy from both fusion zones supports the star against gravity, and the star settles into a new equilibrium, though a more complex one than during the main sequence. The structure now has multiple layers: a carbon-oxygen core, a helium-burning shell, a helium-rich layer, a hydrogen-burning shell, and an extended hydrogen envelope. As the star continues, it cannot fuse heavier and heavier elements indefinitely unless it is very massive. The energy released per fusion reaction decreases as you go to heavier elements, and the temperature required for fusion increases. Carbon fusion requires about 600 million degrees. Oxygen fusion requires over 1 billion degrees. For stars with masses less than about 8 times the Sun's mass, the core never gets hot enough for carbon fusion. The star's journey through the periodic table stops at carbon and oxygen. For our average life story, focused on peaceful endings, we stay with a star that does not end in a violent collapse. A star, like the Sun, will never undergo carbon fusion. Instead, as it exhausts the helium in its core, the core contracts again, heats again, and fusion moves to shells around the core. The star becomes more unstable, pulsating and shedding mass more vigorously. It gradually sheds its outer layers through an increasingly strong stellar wind and through pulses of mass loss, during which the star brightens and expands, then fades and contracts over timescales of thousands of years. This shedding can be framed as a release rather than a destruction. Material that was held close by gravity for eons is finally returned to space, carrying with it elements made inside the star. The hydrogen envelope drifts away as an expanding shell of gas, illuminated by the ultraviolet light from the hot core. This glowing shell is called a planetary nebula, a misleading name chosen by early astronomers who thought these fuzzy round objects looked like planets through their telescopes. Planetary nebulae are among the most beautiful objects in the sky, with intricate shapes and brilliant colors. They can be round, elliptical, or bizarrely complex, with shells, jets, knots, and filaments. The shapes are determined by the star's rotation, magnetic fields, and whether the star has a companion. The colors come from emission lines of different elements: oxygen glowing green, hydrogen glowing red, nitrogen glowing red, each element emitting light at specific wavelengths when energized by the central star's radiation. But the nebula is ephemeral. It expands and disperses over tens of thousands of years, mixing with the interstellar medium and disappearing from view. What remains is the core remnant, a white dwarf. This is a small, dense object, supported not by ongoing fusion, but by the quantum rules that prevent matter from being squeezed infinitely. It no longer generates energy the way it once did. It simply holds heat and slowly cools over a very long time, fading gradually, quietly dimming rather than abruptly ending. A white dwarf is incredibly dense. It has roughly the mass of the Sun packed into a sphere about the size of Earth. A teaspoon of white dwarf material would weigh several tons on Earth. This density is possible because the atoms are crushed so close together that the electrons are stripped from their nuclei. The matter is in a state called electron-degenerate matter, where the electrons are packed as tightly as the laws of quantum mechanics allow. The quantum mechanical principle that prevents further collapse is called the Pauli exclusion principle. It states that no two electrons can occupy the same quantum state simultaneously. As the white dwarf contracts, the electrons are forced into higher and higher energy states because the lower states are all occupied. This creates a pressure, degeneracy pressure, that doesn't depend on temperature, but only on density. This pressure supports the white dwarf against gravity, and it's strong enough to hold the star up even, though there's no fusion happening. In sleep story terms, it is a life that finishes its work and then rests. The white dwarf has no energy source, no fusion burning in its interior. It simply radiates away the heat left over from its previous life. When it first forms, a white dwarf can have a surface temperature of 100,000 degrees, Kelvin or more, making it appear blue-white and extremely bright despite its small size. But over time, it cools. The final stretch lingers on cooling as a kind of cosmic letting go. The white dwarf radiates away its remaining heat, becoming darker and colder as time passes. There is no deadline in this phase, just a gentle slide toward stillness. The cooling process is extraordinarily slow because white dwarfs have a large heat capacity and a small surface area. Theoretical calculations suggest that it takes tens of billions of years for a white dwarf to cool from 100,000 degrees to just a few thousand degrees. The oldest white dwarfs we've observed in our galaxy have cooled for about 10 billion years, roughly the age of the galaxy's oldest stars. They're faint and difficult to detect, glowing with the dim red light of embers that have been cooling for eons. Eventually, after trillions of years, far longer than the universe has existed so far, a white dwarf will cool to the point where it no longer emits visible light at all. It becomes a black dwarf, a dark, cold sphere of degenerate matter, a stellar corpse in the truest sense. But we've never seen a black dwarf because the universe isn't old enough yet. Every white dwarf that has ever formed is still warm enough to glow, at least faintly. The black dwarf stage is purely theoretical, a prediction of what will happen in the unimaginably distant future, when the universe is much older and colder than it is now. The star's story doesn't end with noise. It ends with patience, like a long exhale. There's something peaceful about this ending. The star doesn't fight against its fate. It doesn't struggle or resist. It simply cools, following the path laid out by physics, taking as long as it needs. There's no urgency, no panic, no drama, just a slow, steady decline into darkness and quiet. We close by, widening the perspective. The matter the star released becomes part of the galaxy's ongoing cycle. Gas that can join new clouds, dust that can seed future systems, elements that make later stars and planets more chemically rich. The planetary nebula disperses, spreading the carbon and oxygen made in the star's core, along with traces of other elements, into the surrounding space. This enriched gas mixes with pristine hydrogen and helium left over from the Big Bang, and the mixture becomes the raw material for the next generation of stars. This is how the galaxy evolves chemically over time. The first stars formed from pure hydrogen and helium with almost no heavier elements at all. When those stars died, they returned their material to space, now enriched with carbon, oxygen, and other elements. The next generation of stars formed from this slightly enriched gas, and when they died, they enriched it further. Generation after generation, the interstellar medium becomes richer in heavy elements, and each new generation of stars and planets forms from more chemically diverse material. Our own sun is a third-generation star, maybe fourth, formed from gas that had been cycled through previous stars. The elements in our bodies, the carbon in our cells, the oxygen we breathe, the calcium in our bones, the iron in our blood, were all made inside stars and scattered into space when those stars died. We are, quite literally, made of stardust, assembled from atoms forged in stellar cores and dispersed by stellar winds and supernovae. The star's life, even in its quiet ending, contributes to beginnings elsewhere, and that's the soft landing, a reminder that steadiness is real. Cycles are natural, and you don't have to force anything. Tonight, the universe operates on cycles that span billions of years, cycles of birth and death and rebirth, of matter being transformed and recycled, of energy flowing from stars into space and being captured by planets and living things. These cycles don't require our attention or our effort. They proceed according to the laws of physics, unfolding at their own pace, indifferent to our worries or plans. There's something comforting in that perspective, the knowledge that the universe has been taking care of itself for nearly 14 billion years without any help from us, and it will continue to do so long after we're gone. To bring it back to sleep, we return to the central metaphor of balance, gravity and pressure, inward and outward, held in calm tension. If a star can spend most of its existence simply rebalancing and shining without strain, you can borrow that feeling now. Your body knows how to rest. Your brain knows how to sleep. The systems are already in place. The feedback loops already operating. The balance already being maintained. You don't have to figure out how to fall asleep any more than a star has to figure out how to shine. The process is built in, encoded in your biology, as fundamental as fusion is to a star. All you need to do is allow it to happen. Let go of the effort. Let go of the trying. Just be here, in this moment, in this comfortable position, breathing slowly and steadily. Let your breathing become your equilibrium. Inhale, exhale, and allow everything else to find its own quiet place in the dark. Notice how your breath flows in and out without you having to think about it. How your body knows exactly how much air to take in, when to let it out, how deep or shallow to breathe for this particular moment. It's a self-regulating system, adjusting constantly to your needs without any conscious input. Your heart does the same thing, beating steadily, speeding up when you need more oxygen, slowing down when you're at rest. Your blood pressure, your body temperature, your hormone levels, all of these are regulated by feedback loops that operate automatically, keeping you in balance just as gravity and fusion pressure keep a star in balance. And just as a star slowly dims as it releases its heat into space, you can imagine yourself slowly releasing the heat of the day, the thoughts, the worries, the tensions, letting them radiate away into the quiet darkness of your bedroom. There's no need to hold on to them. They can drift away like the gas from a planetary nebula, dispersing harmlessly, leaving you cooler and calmer and more still. Think about the white dwarf, that small, dense remnant, no longer burning, no longer striving, just resting and cooling, taking all the time in the world. There's no rush. There's nowhere to be, nothing to do. Just this gentle slide toward stillness, this peaceful letting go of heat and light and energy until all that's left is quiet darkness and rest. The universe is very old and very patient. It has been through countless cycles of star formation and death, each one taking millions or billions of years. From the universe's perspective, your night of sleep is less than an instant, a flicker too brief to measure. But it's your instant, your flicker, and it's valuable. It's the time when your body repairs itself, when your brain consolidates memories and clears out metabolic waste, when your immune system does its most important work. Sleep is your body's way of maintaining balance, just as fusion is a star's way of maintaining balance. And just as fusion happens automatically when the conditions are right, sleep happens automatically when you let it. The conditions are right now. You're lying down. You're comfortable. You're safe. It's dark and quiet. Your body knows what to do. So let the stellar cycle continue in your mind if it helps. Imagine clouds of gas slowly contracting, protostars forming, main sequence stars burning steadily for billions of years, red giants expanding and pulsing, white dwarves cooling slowly in the dark. Let the images be vague and dreamy, not something you have to think about actively, just a gentle background drift of thoughts that don't demand your attention, or let the thoughts go entirely. Let there be nothing but breath, nothing but the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the cool air flowing in through your nose, the warm air flowing out. Let there be nothing but the weight of your body on the bed, the softness of the pillow, the warmth of the blankets. Let there be nothing but this moment, this quiet, this stillness. The stars will continue their work without you. The galaxy will keep turning. The universe will keep expanding. And you can rest, knowing that everything is proceeding as it should, that the great cycles continue, that balance is maintained. You can let go and drift, let go and sink, let go and fall into the gentle darkness that's been waiting for you all along. The star shines because it must, because the physics of its core gives it no choice. And you sleep because you must, because the biology of your brain gives you no choice. Once you stop resisting, once you stop trying so hard, sleep isn't something you do. It's something that happens to you when you get out of the way. So get out of the way now. Stop trying. Stop thinking about sleeping. Just lie here and breathe and let the darkness take you, gently, slowly, like a white dwarf cooling into silence, like a star fading at the end of its long, bright life, like all things returning to the quiet from which they came.